Alright, welcome back to Sorare Buy or Buy. Today we're going to be looking at the wonder kid Pedri to see whether he's, overpriced in Sorare terms or underpriced, where I think you should be going out and buying him, or whether I think you should be cashing in, selling him, getting rid and focusing on someone else. So the first point to start on is obviously the price. It's a little bit of a weird one because he's been selling, let me just show you the sale price history here. Looking in limiteds in terms of sterling, he's been selling for 764, 747, but then his floor is actually much lower because someone's gone and listed him a lot lower. So I did actually debate just going out and buying this card, but the fact he's been up for, already like an extra 14 hours and no one's really picked up on it, maybe that is a fair price. So I'm actually going to evaluate Pedri on the fact you can get him for £672 because I think that's a fair deal and he's available to buy right now. Comparing Pedri to, similar players in his price bracket, you have, really only Joey Veerman that's just beating him. So that will be one comparison to look at because obviously if you were to sell Pedri, who are you going to look to replace him? But then also the key thing to note is that he is a Champion Europe player and they typically have a price premium. The really, key reason for it, from my understanding, is that, in Champion Europe, A, the rewards are better, so you'll be able to, win better rewards by placing them in Champion Europe or in the under-23 division, and B, there should be a much reduced risk of transfer, which ruins their scores, and therefore it demands a premium. So in terms of Champion Europe players, Pedri is far above anyone else. He's almost half the price of someone like Shamani or Gavi here. You are absolutely paying a massive price for him, but is it worth it? So the key thing for Pedri, right, is his scores. And the reason for that is because when you're paying that much for a player, you have to be hitting rewards, right? You have to be trying to earn that back. And in terms of Pedri, it's really tough to evaluate because he's played such a little amount of games recently, especially under this new Barcelona system, which obviously you can put some comparisons back historically, but you really want the data to be, as similar as it's going to be to real time. So looking at his scores, they are quite, it's tough to do on Sorare data, but they look fairly solid. But, the biggest issue would be a peak of 85. But you've got to remember, this is only across 15 games. If you were to look at someone else, it would also probably be quite hard in 15 games to gauge whether they're going to be an explosive scorer that can put up hundreds. So when evaluating, I like to put kind of like a top end player, like where I think everything going well, where would you see him? And then on the other side, I like to see like kind of a down end, what happens if everything goes wrong? So my top end player is going to be Vinicius Jr. I really think they can score similarly. If you look here, a 63 average across 15 compared to a 60. Of course, the longer out you go, so a last 40 will be more reliable than a last 15. And in this terms, we don't have that for Pedri. But looking at their scores, I think you can, draw some definite conclusions. If everything was to go well for Pedri, then he could be a similar price for Vinicius Jr. In terms of player, on the downside of what I think he could be like, he's got so much potential, so young. Even if he was benched for the entire year, which I think is a very, very low possibility, it would basically be like a Camavinga score and, consistently coming off the bench, sometime coming off the bench and getting scores, starting once in a while just to, squad fitness and all the rest of it. So that's the downside. And then I want to evaluate Pedri basically on his scores. So this is my kind of evaluation as a starting point, right? So Pedri's floor, you can get for 672. Let's just call it 670 to round. The upside is Vinicius Jr., but I've also added a little bit of premium onto that. The reason for that is just the years, right? I think Vinicius Jr. is 21 and Pedri's 19, at least on their cards, so they'd move in the same kind of age bracket in terms of Sorare terms. So that would make them, 2 years extra utility will have some price difference on it. And then, of course, you do have to compare Vinicius Jr. scores to Pedri's to make sure they are exactly similar. If one was to outperform the other, then obviously there'll be adjustments. But for now, we'll just leave it at the upside of being £1,100, which is totally possible when you look at Haaland at, say, 1,500 or Mbappe's hitting 3,000 at this stage. And then the downside, like I said, Camavinga scores. So looking at, the percentages, again, is very, very difficult to do. But you've got to look, is he going to be making the starting lineup? Because you want a consistent scorer that's going to be playing every week at that price. You can't have any doubts about him. So, starting percentage-wise, you have to just look at how the team can line up. And this was kind of the best article I could find on kind of the squad depth at Barcelona. But every kind of expected lineup that you see, Pedri is always in there ahead of everyone else. So the reason for this, right, is that Pedri's so young that even if he's a little bit worse in terms of footballing ability at this stage, the bigger picture is so much better for Barcelona to be playing him. And to be frankly honest, from my perspective, I think he is good enough to, completely slot into the Barcelona team. When I've watched him, he hasn't been, out of sorts at all. And then you've got things like De Jong, is he going to move to Man United and all the rest of it to consider. So This is pretty much, maybe not the defensive line, but the attacking line is pretty much what I would see as the starting lineup for Barcelona next year. In terms of like risks, you could put Busquets and Kessie in like a in like a central defensive two against like say Real Madrid or on the Champions League, where you're going to need a little more kind of defensive action. So that leaves one spot between Pedri and De Jong, and let's say possibly Gavi as well. And then it's like, well, who's more likely to get that spot? If they're looking to offload De Jong, but they're looking to keep Pedri, I think it's probably more likely that Pedri will get that spot. And that's why I've put it at like a 95%. I would put it at 100%, but obviously we haven't had the availability to see. So for me, it's a 95%. And then it's like, what are the chances of scoring to his upside? And this is where it will get really, this is where it will get really controversial potentially, because for me, I actually think Pedri can outperform Vinicius Jr. next year. So just looking back at the last 15 scores, right, which I showed you before, I cut out the game where he was injured because obviously it's not very fair, and there's a couple of sub appearances in there, which will bring down the average, but that's kind of natural. The reason he's coming off the bench is because they've got bigger games coming up, and that's the same across every squad in the world basically. So a decisive average of 42, an AA all-round score of 19 gives a total score average of 61. So if you were to perform a 61 average, that's pretty much on par with how Vinicius Jr. has been scoring recently. I'll just pull them up again here. 61 in the middle of these two numbers, 63 on the high end. So what possible reasons could Pedri's scores be increasing next year? Well, firstly, there's the availability of being in the squad each week. So, rather than having to come back from injuries and then fight your way back into the squad, you can just get in there. You'll know how everyone plays. And then, of course, you have the big acquisition of, the whole Barcelona team has improved. We've got Rafinha, we've got Lewandowski coming in, we've got Kessie at the back to, strengthen it. I really think that Barcelona's side this year will be a completely different animal to what we saw last year. And obviously, the attacking players that are going to get involved in those decisive actions are really going to benefit more. And Pedri's kind of like box to box, but he is actually a lot more attacking than I think people realise. So if you look at his kind of heat graph here, you can look at it and you see, very much this left side of midfield, kind of left attacking mid position, where he's very dominant, but he also does get into the box. And if I could just really preface this example to show you how far forward he gets, this is Neymar's graph. So obviously Neymar's a lot more red because he's on the ball a lot more, but positional sense, he is in almost exactly the same position. So I'll just show you some highlights from Pedri's game here to show where I really think he is an attacking midfielder that can create so many chances next year, which is going to increase his AA score. And if they're being put away by a clinical finisher like Lewandowski, it's also going to increase his decisive scores. Beyond that, he can also sit back and play deep balls, which is also very beneficial. And then just open up the play, and then you even have little chances of opportunity for double doubles and triple triples and all the rest of it. So I do kind of think he's almost a complete player in terms of scoring. So it's for all those reasons why, someone like Joey Veerman, I really think Pedri can put up the equal kind of scores as him, if not outperform him. Of course, there's a bit of if, buts, and maybes. How does Lewandowski sit in, and, does he get in the squad, all the rest of it. But for me, the score at the upside is a very, very minimal risk. Like, I'm fully expecting Pedri to, perform as he has been performing, if not slightly better. And that's why his scores are being there. All of the available data we have shows him as a last 15 average of 61. So it's not too far to push him to, Veerman 62 or Junior's 63. So for me, that's not a risk. And the only risk we have remaining is the kind of injury risk. And this is, trying to put a number on this is just absolutely ridiculous. So I've gone with a broad 90%. I think that'd be pretty fair across the board for any player that's been injured, but, maybe doesn't have the risk of coming back to the same injury. So, a 10% haircut is pretty fair. And then there, you're pretty much at £900 for Pedri when his expected price you can get him now for is 670. And this is why I'm absolutely mad about Pedri. I think, if people were to pick Veerman over Pedri, it's just an absolute disaster plan. Pedri has more years utility, he has international utility. I think he'll be as good, if not a better scorer. He has no risk of being transfers, and he's sitting in what could be the best team in the world next year. So for me, if you haven't worked out already, of course, Pedri is a buy. I'd love to go get another Pedri, but I just haven't got the funds for it. Do let me know if you disagree in the comments. Of course, this evaluation is based on the next year, year and a half, 2 years. So it's all about who can score the most points whilst keeping their value. So, if Pedri doesn't perform, obviously that value will probably slightly decrease. But it's the same risk for every other player, right? If Veerman starts to put some of his more recent scores up where he was having, negative decisive actions and was killing lineups with 25s, for example, those are also going to play into, price movement. So for me, Pedri is a far more complete investment, let's say, or a far more complete player for your SO5 scores next year. Very, very controversial that I don't think that will be a consistent theme. I don't think that'll be a theme that everyone believes in. But, you know, this is part of the Sorare game. I'm happy to be wrong, and part of this journey is that if I am wrong, I can reflect on this video and think, okay, so what stats did I over-evaluate? Which stats did I under-evaluate? If you did like this, please leave a like and leave a comment below what you think. You know, Pedri, Veerman, Vinicius Jr., who would you take out of them? For me, it would probably be Pedri still. I absolutely think he's going to be fantastic long-term and short-term. All the best to you. Cheers.